What really happened inside those tents when the music stopped and the crowd lost control? I'm 91 years old now, and for 52 years I carried a secret that was born in the mud, noise, and confusion of Woodstock. A secret that never appeared in any documentary, police report, or history book. Back then, in August of 1969, I was just another ordinary young man surrounded by 500,000 people, convinced we were witnessing peace, love, and freedom. That's the story everyone remembers. What no one talks about is how quickly that illusion cracked once the sun went down. The drugs were everywhere, the rain turned the ground into a trap, and strangers stopped feeling harmless. Inside that chaos, privacy vanished, and fear quietly replaced euphoria. I had pitched my tent near the edge of the field, thinking distance would keep me safe. It didn't. That night, someone unzipped my tent without asking. I still remember the sound of the fabric, slow and deliberate, cutting through the music, echoing in the distance. I didn't scream. No one would have heard me anyway. Woodstock was loud, but it was also full of silence where it mattered. What followed inside that tent wasn't just confusion or a bad trip. It was a moment that tied me to something darker, something that forced me to choose between survival and truth. People like to believe nothing truly terrible could happen at a place built on ideals, but that belief is exactly why so many things were buried. Woodstock was, overcrowded, understaffed, and completely unprepared for what people became when boundaries disappeared. I watched someone make a decision that night that couldn't be undone. I saw fear in another person's eyes that matched my own. And in those few minutes, I understood something terrifying. If I spoke, my life would never be the same. The system wasn't built to protect witnesses like me. It was built to keep the myth alive. For decades, I told myself it was better to stay silent, to let history remember Woodstock as a symbol instead of a crime scene. But silence has a weight, and it grows heavier with age. As my body weakened, that memory stayed sharp, waiting for the moment I would finally stop running from it and face what really happened in my tent that night. Before this story goes any further, I need to ask you something important. Stories like this don't survive unless people are willing to face uncomfortable truths. What happened at Woodstock wasn't just music and freedom. It was a moment where reality slipped through the cracks, and understanding that matters more than most people realize. If you're listening to this and you feel that quiet tension in your chest, that means you already sense there's more hidden beneath the surface of history. I want you to tell me in the comments what you think really happened at Woodstock after dark. Even a single word matters. You can write truth, silence, or confession. Reading those words tells me I'm not the only one carrying this weight. Leave a like if you believe stories buried for decades deserve to be heard, and subscribe to the channel if you want to stay with me until the very end of this confession. What comes next isn't easier to tell. It's where the real danger began, inside that tent, when I realized I wasn't alone with the secret anymore. When I say I wasn't alone with that secret anymore, I don't mean rumors or guesses. I mean another human being, breathing inches away from me in the dark, carrying fear just as heavy as mine. Inside that tent, time stopped behaving normally. Minutes stretched, sounds blurred, and the music from the main stage faded into something distant and unreal, like it belonged to another world entirely. The person who stepped inside wasn't a stranger in the way people imagine. That's what made it worse. We had spoken earlier that day, shared food, laughed about how history would remember this place. They trusted me enough to come close, and I trusted them enough to let my guard down. Woodstock was supposed to be safe. That belief cost both of us more than we understood at the time. The smell of wet canvas, sweat, and something metallic filled the air. I noticed their hands shaking, not from drugs, but from panic. They kept repeating that something had gone wrong, that it wasn't supposed to happen like this. I didn't know what this meant yet, but I knew instinctively that once I did, I would never be able to unlearn it. Outside, people screamed in joy. Inside, a quiet confession began to form, broken sentences spilling out between shallow breaths. They told me about a confrontation, about someone who wouldn't back away, about a moment where fear turned into force. No names, no clear timeline, just fragments, sharp enough to cut through any illusion I still had left about peace and love. Then came the sentence that froze me in place. A sentence so simple, so final, that my body reacted before my mind could. Someone wasn't going to wake up when the sun rose. And suddenly, my tent wasn't shelter anymore. It was evidence. It was a grave for the truth, zipped shut while 500,000 people danced a few yards away. I understood then why no one would ever talk about this. There were no authorities capable of handling it, no reporters looking for darkness, only ordinary people, high, exhausted, terrified, and desperate to survive the night without becoming part of the story. And by listening, by staying silent, I became connected to something far bigger than a single act. I became part of the reason it vanished. I carried that weight out of the tent with me, knowing the next choices I made would define the rest of my life, especially when the morning came and the bodies, both seen and unseen, began to matter. By the time the sky began to lighten, the drugs had stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like a trap. People stumbled through the mud with vacant eyes, some crying, some laughing for no reason, most of them barely aware of where they were. That chaos became the perfect hiding place for fear. Nothing stood out. Nothing was questioned. And that was exactly why the truth disappeared so easily. The person who had spoken to me inside the tent never said another word in daylight. We passed each other once near the food lines. Our eyes met for less than a second, and in that glance I saw a silent agreement form. Not a spoken pact, not a plan, just mutual understanding. If either of us talked, the other would be dragged down with them. At Woodstock, guilt didn't belong to one person. It spread quietly, through proximity and silence. I tried to convince myself it was just drugs, that memories formed under those conditions couldn't be trusted. LSD, mescaline, bad reactions, paranoia. Everyone had a story. That excuse worked for a while. It worked when I went back home. It worked when I finished school, got married, raised children. But fear has a way of aging with you. It doesn't fade, it sharpens. Every time I saw footage of Woodstock on television, the music made my stomach tighten. Every anniversary felt like a lie being celebrated. People spoke about peace and revolution, while I remembered whispers, trembling hands, and a truth that had no place to land. I knew then that if I ever spoke, no one would believe me. There were no records, no names, no bodies officially acknowledged. Just a story that threatened a cultural myth too big to challenge. So I chose silence. Not because it was right, but because it was survivable. And survival, in that moment, felt like the only moral option left. What I didn't understand was how silence slowly turns into complicity, and how carrying a secret for decades doesn't protect you. It imprisons you. By the second night, whispers moved faster than the rain. Not rumors you could trace, not stories with clear beginnings, but fragments. Someone missing, someone hurt, someone who left early. At Woodstock, disappearance was easy. With hundreds of thousands of people, a single absence blended into the noise. That's when I realized how fragile truth becomes when no one is responsible for holding it. I learned what had really happened through pieces, never all at once. A body found near the tree line, they said. No identification, no announcement. Someone decided it was an overdose. Someone else decided it was better not to decide at all. The person who confided in me never used. the word death, but their silence afterward confirmed everything their voice couldn't say the night before. What haunts me most is how quickly order replaced chaos once it mattered. Volunteers redirected foot traffic. A small group moved quietly, efficiently, as if this wasn't their first time making something disappear. No sirens, no questions, no photographs. Woodstock couldn't afford a death that didn't fit the narrative. Peace, love, and music don't survive headlines about violence. I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Two men arguing about paperwork that would never be filed. One of them said, "If we start documenting this, it never ends." That sentence stayed with me for decades. It wasn't about one person anymore. It was about protecting an idea, a moment in history that people needed to believe was pure. And just like that, an ordinary human life became an inconvenience. No family notified, no investigation, just a quiet agreement carried by exhaustion and fear. The truth didn't vanish because it was impossible to find. It vanished because too many people decided it was easier not to look. For years, I told myself what happened was an exception, a tragic accident swallowed by chaos. But the older I got, the more I understood Woodstock wasn't just unprepared. It was the perfect environment for things to disappear. No fences, no real security, no reliable records of who came and who left. It wasn't just a festival. It was a temporary blind spot in history. What most people don't realize is that long before Woodstock, authorities already knew massive gatherings created plausible deniability. Too many witnesses cancel each other out. Too many stories make truth negotiable. That weekend, responsibility dissolved into the mud along with everything else. When something went wrong, there was no single hand to point at, and that protected everyone who needed protection. I began noticing patterns in the years that followed. Stories from other festivals, other protests, other moments in history where idealism collided with reality, and someone quietly paid the price. Always the same ingredients: drugs, exhaustion, fear, and the unspoken understanding that exposing the truth would damage something larger than one life. Myth is powerful. People defend it instinctively. The person connected to that night vanished from my life soon after. New name, new city, no explanation. At the time, I thought they were running from guilt. Now I realize they were taught how to disappear. Ordinary people don't learn that on their own. Someone helped. Someone explained how silence works, how memories fade, how time protects secrets better than lies ever could. That realization changed how I saw everything. Government statements, historical footage, even family stories passed down like facts. I started asking myself how many peaceful moments were polished after the fact. How many uncomfortable truths were edited out to preserve a feeling people wanted to keep. Woodstock didn't just hide one death. It taught a generation that some truths are negotiable if the story is beautiful enough. And once you understand that, you start seeing the cracks everywhere, including in places much closer to home than a muddy field in 1969. Time did what it always does. It moved forward without asking permission, leaving that weekend behind like a closed chapter everyone else forgot to reread. I built a life. I worked. I raised children. I smiled in photographs. But some faces don't fade the way others do. One stayed with me, unchanged, frozen in that dim light inside the tent, eyes wide with the kind of fear that rewires your memory forever. I saw that face in strangers on the subway, in news footage, in crowds where no one stood out. Every time, my body reacted before my mind could correct itself. A tightening in the chest, a pause in my breath. Guilt doesn't announce itself loudly. It waits. It learns your routines. It shows up when you least expect it, usually when you're pretending everything is fine. Years later, I read about unexplained deaths connected to large gatherings, protests, and festivals from the same era. Always vague language, always uncertainty, always the suggestion that drugs were to blame. I recognized the pattern immediately. It wasn't proof, but it was familiar enough to hurt. Silence had a formula, and I had seen it written once before in mud and rain. What terrified me most wasn't the memory of that night. It was the realization that I could die without ever speaking, that the truth could end with me, zipped shut like that tent, never to be opened again. I imagined the family of the person who never came home, living decades without answers, inventing their own explanations because no one gave them the real one. There were moments I almost spoke, anniversaries, late nights, hospital rooms, but fear ages differently than courage. Fear grows cautious. It whispers that it's too late, that no one would believe an old man now, that history has already decided what Woodstock was supposed to mean. But secrets rot when they're sealed too long. And lately, when I look in the mirror, I don't see the man I was protecting anymore. I see the last witness to something that was never meant to survive time. And that's when I understood why this confession can't wait any longer, especially with what comes next. I'm confessing this now because time has removed every excuse I once hid behind. The people who could deny it are gone. The systems that protected the silence have moved on to newer myths. And I no longer fear consequences the way I did when I was young, when a single accusation could destroy an entire future. At 91, the future doesn't threaten me anymore. The past does. What finally broke me wasn't age alone. It was realizing how easily history gets rewritten when ordinary people stay quiet. Woodstock became a symbol taught in schools, sold in documentaries, celebrated as proof that something pure once existed. But symbols are fragile. They're built on selective memory, and sometimes on the deliberate erasure of inconvenient truths. I kept asking myself who I was protecting all these years. Not the victim, not their family, not even myself, if I'm honest. I was protecting a story that didn't need protection anymore. A lie doesn't stay noble just because it's old. It just becomes heavier to carry. There's another reason I waited. Confessions change, meaning over time. In 1969, this would have been chaos. In the 1980s, scandal. In the 2000s, skepticism. Now, it becomes something else entirely, a record, a warning. Proof that even the most celebrated moments in history have shadows we choose not to examine. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for understanding. I'm leaving this here because truth doesn't belong to the young or the powerful alone. Sometimes it belongs to the last person still alive who remembers how it really felt, when the music stopped and reality stepped in. If you made it all the way here, thank you for staying with this confession until the very last word. Stories like this only exist because someone chooses to listen when the truth finally comes out. If you believe hidden histories deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next confession waiting to be uncovered. Leave a like if this story changed the way you see Woodstock or history itself. And if you stayed until the end, I want you to comment exactly this. The truth never dies. That tells me you were here, that you listened, and that this secret didn't disappear again. Now look at the next video appearing on your screen. Another voice is ready to confess something they carried for a lifetime. Stay with us.